Normandy, July 1944, a hedgerow east of St. Lo. A German paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division lies pressed into the base of an earthen bank wrapped in a smock cut in a pattern that a Munich art professor had designed 7 years earlier. His helmet is covered, his face is blackened. The grass around him has not moved in nearly 6 hours. He has done everything his training demanded of him. No patrol walks the lane. No scout points toward his position. No spotter calls out a sighting. Then, without warning, an 81mm mortar round detonates 10 feet above his head. Then a second, then a third. His squad mate, captured days later and questioned by American intelligence officers, says something that, in various forms, echoes through accounts of German prisoners questioned that summer. We were not seen. It is a strange complaint from a prisoner of war. He is not claiming the Americans missed. He is claiming they found him without ever finding him at all. 6 weeks earlier, the same camouflage, worn by the same kind of soldier in the same terrain, had been slaughtering British infantry by the thousand. So why did the ghosts of the hedgerows stop being ghosts the moment the enemy changed? The hedgerow runs east to west, a wall of packed earth 4 feet high, crowned with hawthorn and bramble that has grown wild and unmanaged since before the war. Beneath the root, in a hollow scraped out by German pioneers days earlier, a paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division lies on his stomach with his rifle resting on a fold of sacking so the barrel will not glint. His smock is printed in a mottled pattern of green and brown, blurred at the edges rather than cut into hard geometric shapes. Designed to mimic the way sunlight breaks apart when it falls through a forest canopy, it is reversible, green side out for June. He has worn it for 6 weeks and has come to trust it the way a man trusts a bridge. He has crossed 100 times. The smell of crushed grass and cordite clings to the hollow he has dug for himself. Flies gather at the corner of his eye, and he does not blink them away, because blinking is also motion, and motion is the one thing his instructors told him he could not afford. His hands have gone stiff around the stock of his rifle. His knees ache against the packed earth. Somewhere behind him, out of sight, a battery of mortars he has never seen and will never meet, waits on coordinates chalked onto a board, and he does not know they exist, because his part of the war was never designed to require that knowledge. His part of the war was to be invisible, and to trust that invisibility was enough. He has not moved in nearly 6 hours. Not his hand, not his head, not the angle of his rifle. His training told him that stillness is the camouflage. The pattern only works if the man wearing it behaves like part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. Every instructor who drilled this into German recruits said some version of the same sentence. The eye does not find shapes, it finds motion. A soldier who can lie still longer than the enemy can watch is invisible. Whatever he is wearing, nothing suggests he has been found. No patrol has walked the sunken lane in front of him. No scout has slowed his pace near the bank. No voice has called out a sighting to anyone behind the line. By every rule he was ever taught, he is safe. Then, with no warning that either lecture or experience had prepared him for, an 81mm mortar shell bursts 10 feet above his position. A second follows. A third. He does not survive to describe what happened, but the man beside him does, and is taken prisoner within days. American intelligence officers question him at a collection point behind the lines, the kind of hurried interview conducted in a tent or the back of a truck. The prisoner still dazed, the interrogator working from a printed list of questions about unit strength and positions. What the German soldier says is not on that list, and it does not fit the shape of an ordinary complaint. He does not say the mortar crews got lucky. He does not say the position was betrayed. He says, in words that, according to accounts of German prisoner interrogations from that summer, recurred again and again with only small variation, that his comrade was not seen, not spotted, not observed, simply not seen, and killed anyway. The interrogating officer writes the phrase down without fully understanding why the prisoner keeps returning to it. To an American ear, it sounds almost like an excuse, a wounded man's way of avoiding blame, but the prisoner is not offering an excuse. He repeats it the way a man repeats something that has broken his understanding of how the world is supposed to work, checking it against memory again and again to see if it will finally make sense. It does not. The paper is filed, the prisoner is moved to the rear, the sentence sits in a folder that will not be read closely again for years. It is a strange thing for a prisoner of war to insist on. Soldiers accept that they can be found and killed. What troubles this man, and what troubles the others who say some version of the same thing in tent after tent, that July is a violation of a rule he had understood to be fixed. In the war he had trained for, a man had to be located before he could be destroyed. Concealment was supposed to be a form of safety, not merely a delay. If the enemy could kill a soldier without ever locating him, then the entire discipline of hiding, the 6 motionless hours, the mud rubbed into the fabric, the reversible smock built by a professor who had spent years studying how light moves through leaves, had purchased nothing at all. 6 weeks before that, mortar found the paratrooper east of St. Lo, the identical camouflage system, worn by a different kind of German soldier in a different sector of the same terrain, had been doing exactly what it was designed to do. It had been killing British soldiers in numbers that would come to define the entire Normandy campaign for the men who survived it. The country east of Caen is built the way the country around St. Lo is built, in small, irregular fields, bounded by earthen banks and centuries of untouched hedge growth, a patchwork that French farmers call bocage, and that British soldiers would come to describe with something close to dread. A single field might run 40 yards across, sometimes 200, walled on every side by vegetation, thick enough to swallow a man standing 10 feet away. Visibility that in open country might extend for a mile could shrink here to 15 yards in any direction. It was not terrain built for war. It had been built over hundreds of years for cattle and cider apples. War simply arrived and used what was already there. British infantrymen moving through it, the June carried the particular unease of men who had trained for a war of open ground and long sight lines, and now found themselves pushing through lanes so narrow and overgrown that 2 men could not walk abreast without their shoulders brushing thorn on either side. Sunlight fell through the canopy in broken coins rather than sheets, and every one of those coins of light could, in theory, be a man lying still. A soldier learned quickly that the silence of a hedgerow told him nothing. The birds still sang. The cattle, when there were any left alive, still grazed in the next field over. Nothing about the sound of the place changed in the seconds before it killed him. German infantry and armor units defending this ground wore the same family of patterns as the paratrooper who would later die outside St. Lo. In some cases, the very same garments issued from the same depots. They dug into the hedge banks rather than behind them, cutting firing positions into the earth itself so a man could shift from one side of a field to the other without ever standing upright or breaking the tree line. A single well-hidden rifleman, invisible until the moment he fired, was often enough to stop an entire advancing platoon in its tracks, not because he killed many men outright, but because his single shot told every soldier behind him that the position ahead was occupied by someone they could not see and therefore could not safely approach. By the end of August, 1,944 British, Canadian, and Polish forces fighting through this ground had suffered casualties in the tens of thousands. A large share of the killing came not from the rifleman in the hedge at all, but from what his single shot made possible: German mortar and rocket batteries, positioned well behind the front line and directed by forward observers, who had simply watched where the advancing troops went to ground, could bring fire down onto a stalled position within minutes. The camouflage did not need to kill anyone by itself. It only needed to buy the few seconds required for a man to fire once, vanish, and let the artillery finish what his rifle had started. Accounts written by the men who survived that fighting describe an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Advancing units reported taking fire from positions that, when finally overrun, sometimes turned out to be empty. The German rifleman, having relocated the moment his first shot was fired, officers who had spent years fighting in the open desert of North Africa, where a man could see an enemy position from half a mile away and plan an attack against a confirmed target, found themselves applying that same instinct to ground where nothing could be confirmed until it was already too late. Letters written home by British soldiers that summer, when they mention the hedgerows at all, tend to circle the same helpless image: an enemy who could not be pointed at, only endured. A man might advance 20 yards into a field and lose 2 friends without ever raising his own rifle to a target, because there had been no target to raise it at, only a muzzle flash from a bank already 50 yards behind him by the time he turned to look. It was a war that punished the instinct to look for an enemy and rewarded, instead, only the instinct to survive whatever came next. So the same question that would puzzle a captured paratrooper east of St. Lo had already been answered once, brutally, in favor of the German army. In the fields east of Caen, the camouflage worked. The discipline behind it worked. A soldier who could hold still for 6 hours in a pattern designed to mimic dappled light was, by any honest measure, very difficult to see. And difficult to see meant difficult to kill, which raises the only question that matters for what follows if the same pattern worn by the same kind of soldier, trained to the same standard of stillness, had spent 2 months proving itself against one Allied army. What changed 6 weeks later, in similar ground, against a different one? The paratrooper east of St. Lo had done nothing his training had failed to anticipate. He had simply been killed by an enemy operating on a theory of warfare that did not require seeing him at all. One built not in France but 2 decades earlier on a training ground in Oklahoma by men solving a problem that had nothing to do with camouflage and everything to do with what an army does when it cannot see the man it needs to kill. To understand why the man in the hedgerow trusted his smock as much as he did, it helps to go back 13 years to a decision made not by soldiers but by an army bureaucracy trying to solve a manufacturing problem. In 1931, the German army issued a 4-color disruptive pattern called splitter tarn, hard-edged polygons of green and brown scattered over a tan field, with thin vertical dashes suggesting falling rain. It was designed first for the triangular shelter quarter every infantryman carried folded in his pack, and only later adapted into helmet covers and jump smocks. The hard edges were not an artistic choice. They were a concession to the printing presses of the period, which could reproduce straight lines and sharp polygons far more cheaply and accurately than anything organic. Splitter tarn worked well enough. It was not, by the standards of what came after it, especially clever. The more sophisticated version of the idea began with a Waffen-SS officer named Wim Brandt, an engineer who commanded an SS reconnaissance unit and who went looking in the mid-1930s for something better than splitter tarn could offer. He found Johann Georg Otto Schick, a Munich art professor whose academic training was in textile and pattern design rather than anything military, Schick had spent years studying, in a purely artistic context, the way light breaks apart as it passes through a moving forest canopy, how it falls in a scatter of shifting patches rather than a fixed shape. It was an unusual background for a man about to shape how thousands of soldiers would try to stay alive. Schick had to convince skeptical army engineers that what he understood about painting and light had anything at all to offer a rifleman lying in a ditch. What Schick understood, and what set his work apart from every camouflage pattern issued by any other army at the time, was a specific fact about human vision. The eye is extremely good at finding sharp edges and repeating shapes. It is very bad at finding a pattern that has neither. Working with an assistant, the artist Adolf Schmid, Schick designed a family of patterns unlike anything that had appeared on a European battlefield before. Blurred, organic, built from soft, overlapping shapes rather than hard polygons. The first of these, a pattern based on the mottled bark and leaf shadow of the plane tree, was issued to the SS Deutschland Regiment for field trials in 1937. Officers ran controlled comparisons, positioning trained observers at varying distances in light conditions and timing how quickly they could spot soldiers wearing the new pattern against soldiers in ordinary field gray. The results were striking enough that the Army moved to patent the designs the following year. A second and more refined pattern, built around the layered shape of oak leaves and eventually made reversible, spring green on one side and autumn brown on the other, followed a few years later and would become the most widely issued of Schick's designs by the time of the Normandy invasion by June 1944. Elite German formations. The paratroopers of the Fallschirmjäger divisions and the Panzergrenadiers of the Waffen-SS armored divisions carried what was by any honest technical measure the most advanced individual camouflage system fielded by any army on Earth. No other major combatant would field anything comparable until long after the war had ended. Factories in Germany turned out the pattern by the tens of thousands of yards, printed onto cotton twill and cut into smocks, helmet covers, and the triangular tent quarters. Every infantryman still carried a quiet industrial commitment to a piece of equipment that most of the men issuing it never expected. Ordinary soldiers, let alone future historians, to think of as anything more than cloth. Picture what this looked like in practice. 3 weeks before the mortar found the paratrooper outside St. Lo, a Waffen-SS Panzergrenadier of the 12th SS Panzer Division settles into a hedge bank north of Caen, wearing Schick's oak leaf pattern, green side out. Around him, 6-foot earthen banks, topped with bramble and hawthorn that have grown undisturbed for longer than anyone in the division has been alive. Soldiers who fought through this ground later described a feeling of suspecting danger in every blade of grass. The German soldier is not simply crouched behind the bank. He is dug into it, tunneled beneath the root system, so he can shift his aim from one side of the field to the other without ever standing or breaking the tree line. A degree of engineering that German pioneer units had clearly invested days preparing well before any British soldier reached the position, which suggests defensive planning that anticipated the value of this ground months in advance, rather than improvising it under fire. The British paid for that preparation in a currency that historians have since tried to measure precisely. Formal accounts of the fighting east of Caen describe British infantry advancing against what more than one official history calls, without much qualification, an almost invisible enemy. Casualties among British, Canadian, and Polish forces in Normandy climbed steeply through June and July, and a large share of it, by most post-war estimates, came not from direct rifle fire but from mortar and rocket fire, directed by observers the advancing infantry never located. It was an economical system A thin screen of camouflaged forward positions along every hedgerow crest existed not to win a firefight outright, but to fix the British position and radio its coordinates back to mortar. And rocket batteries positioned thousands of yards to the rear, batteries that did the actual killing from a range no rifleman could reach in return. For the man on the receiving end, the experience had a particular psychological weight that outlasted the physical danger itself. A soldier could accept in the abstract that he might be killed by an enemy he had fought and seen. It was harder to accept an anonymous, weightless death. A shell arriving from a battery whose crew never once laid eyes on the man they killed. Summoned by a spotter who had simply watched a column of exhausted infantry stop moving in a field that looked from a distance exactly like every other field around it. No Allied camouflage program of the period came close to matching what Schick's research had produced. British and Canadian infantry fought through this ground largely in plain khaki battle dress, with only scattered, unofficial use of foliage stuffed into webbing, or the sniper-specific smocks issued to a small number of specialists. German infantry across multiple divisions, by contrast, wore standardized, mass-produced patterns, purpose-built for exactly the terrain they were defending. The British Army, absorbing these losses, was not undertrained or poorly led. Many of its units carried veterans of North Africa, Italy, and Crete, fighting under a careful doctrine built around a rolling artillery barrage, followed by infantry advancing in disciplined stages against a positively identified objective, a method that had been refined over 3 hard years of fighting German positions across open desert, where flat ground and long sight lines let aerial reconnaissance locate an enemy position well before an attack began. In the western desert, this doctrine had been broadly effective because the terrain cooperated with its central assumption that the enemy could be found before he needed to be engaged. The bocage destroyed that assumption completely. A British rifle section, 8 to 10 men built around a single Bren gun and a handful of bolt action. Lee-Enfield rifles capable of perhaps 15 aimed rounds a minute in skilled hands, operated on the premise that an attack meant closing on a position that had already been confirmed, then suppressing and clearing what was actually found there. Officers who had learned their trade at El Alamein, where visibility might run to a mile or more, now found that doctrine applied to ground where visibility might run to 15 yards. Post-war historians examining British infantry performance in Normandy have acknowledged that units sometimes showed more caution than a given tactical situation strictly required. Going to ground and calling for artillery support even against fairly limited opposition. One well-known account of the campaign put the underlying dynamic bluntly. The British fought a careful, methodical war in this terrain, while the Germans fought fast and aggressively and were extraordinarily good at it in exactly this kind of fight. That was not a comment on the courage of British soldiers. It was a comment on which side's doctrine matched the ground it was being asked to fight on. One veteran who fought along the River Odon later recalled a detail that captures the asymmetry better than any casualty figure. If a German soldier ever did appear in the open, he said, every rifle in the section fired at him at once. The detail matters because of how rarely it happened. A German rifleman firing from concealment beneath Schick's pattern would fire once, then relocate before firing again. A British section that took a single casualty from a position it could not identify did precisely what its training specified, going to ground and calling for support, while the German mortar crews to the rear, already supplied with coordinates by an observer who had simply watched the British line approach and then stopped moving, opened fire on a target that had obligingly stopped presenting itself. The single engagement most often used to illustrate this dynamic took place at the town of Villers-Bocage on the 13th of June. The British 7th Armored Division, veteran of 3 years of mobile desert warfare, where exactly this kind of methodical advance had repeatedly proven effective, pushed a reconnaissance column through the town in an attempt to outflank German defenses around Caen, and SS-Tank commanded by Michael Wittmann, part of a heavy panzer battalion holding positions nearby, engaged the column from a concealed position along the road in the space of roughly 15 minutes, in an action that also involved other tanks from his unit. Wittmann's Tiger alone accounted for a large share of the destruction. Tanks, half-tracks, and reconnaissance cars destroyed or disabled along a narrow main street where the column had no room to maneuver and little ability to return effective fire. The Tiger's heavy frontal armor made it functionally immune to the British vehicle's guns. At the ranges involved, by the time the fighting at Villers-Bocage was over, the British brigade group involved had suffered well over 200 casualties and lost more than 20 tanks. What made Villers-Bocage relevant to the broader pattern was not any single tank commander's skill, considerable as it clearly was, but the structural reason the column had been vulnerable to that kind of engagement in the first place. The 7th Armored's advance had proceeded according to a doctrine built for terrain where an approaching column could expect early warning, visual contact with enemy armor at hundreds or thousands of yards, and time to deploy into a fighting formation before contact was made. The bocage offered none of that warning. A single, well-concealed tank, applying exactly the same camouflage principles, protecting German infantry in the hedgerows, could engage a road-bound column from point-blank range before anyone in that column had any indication a threat existed at all. The mechanism that made Schick's camouflage devastating against infantry had simply been scaled up to 60 tons of armored steel, and British doctrine had no immediate answer for it. What neither army fighting that battle yet understood was that a wholly different theory of how to find an enemy was about to arrive on the same ground, carried by soldiers who had never been taught that seeing a man was a precondition for killing him. That theory had not been built in France. It had been built 2 decades earlier, on threadbare budgets, at Fort Benning in Georgia and Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Institutions belonging to an American army that in 1939 ranked 17th in the world, by size smaller than the Army of Romania, chronically underfunded, through a decade of economic depression that had cut most government spending to the bone. What that marginal, underfunded institution had in certain specific pockets was a habit of taking its own casualty studies from the previous war seriously, at a moment when most of the world's major militaries were more interested in refighting their last victory than interrogating their own losses. American infantry doctrine, through the 1920s and 1930s, absorbed a specific lesson from internal studies of First World War, small arms fighting in modern combat. The enemy is mostly invisible, dug into a trench, a hedge, a building, and most infantry fire on both sides during that war had been directed at suspected rather than confirmed positions. The rounds that did the actual killing were simply the ones that happened to land where an enemy actually was. French and German staff studies of the same war reached broadly similar conclusions. What differed was what the American Army chose to build in response. 2 decisions followed from that lesson, and together they shaped the war the American riflemen would fight in Normandy. The first was the M1 Garand, adopted as the standard infantry rifle in 1936. The only semi-automatic rifle issued as standard equipment by any major combatant of the entire war. The decision had been contested for years inside the Army's own ordnance bureaucracy, with traditionalists arguing that a semi-automatic weapon would waste ammunition and erode the fire discipline. A slower bolt-action rifle enforced by its own mechanical limits. The argument that won held the opposite view. That volume of fire directed at a suspected position was worth more than disciplined. Conserved fire aimed only at a confirmed one and that an army willing to spend ammunition liberally needed a rifle capable of delivering it. A trained American rifleman could fire something in the range of 20 aimed rounds a minute from a Garand. A trained British rifleman with a Lee Enfield could manage roughly 50. The German carabiner 98K's practical rate was lower still, scaled to a full squad. The difference stopped being incremental and became structural. An American rifle squad built around a single Browning automatic rifle, and a group of Garands could put several hundred rounds downrange in a minute, far outpacing what a comparable British section could manage with its single Bren gun and its bolt-action rifles. That volume meant an American squad could afford to fire at a location it merely suspected, rather than one it had positively confirmed, without giving up its ability to keep moving and observing at the same time. The second decision was doctrinal, and the Army gave it a name with no attempt at euphemism: reconnaissance by fire. Field manuals of the period instructed units to fire deliberately on terrain likely to conceal an enemy position, specifically to provoke a response that would reveal where he actually was. In Normandy, this became a repeatable, almost mechanical procedure. American armored columns trained their main guns and machine guns alternately left and right of their line of advance, firing more or less continuously into any terrain that might be concealing a threat. Tank and infantry teams approaching a hedgerow raked the foliage with machine gun fire before a single infantryman stepped through the gap. Supply trucks moving along partially cleared roads mounted heavy machine guns on their cabs and used them the same way. The Army's own post-war analysis of the fighting stated the principle without apology: when tanks lead an attack, they must use their guns for reconnaissance by fire, and hedgerows should be raked with machine gun fire as a matter of standard practice. Independent of whether any specific threat had actually been identified, consider what this meant from the perspective of a man like the paratrooper who would later die outside St. Lo. A soldier wearing Schick's most sophisticated pattern, dug into a hedge bank so completely that his own company commander might have walked past without seeing him, could encounter, as the very first event of an American advance, a machine gun burst, raking across his position with no patrol, no scout, and no confirmed sighting preceding it. The tank or the squad had not paused to determine whether he was there. It had treated the hedge as occupied by default and fired on that assumption alone because the doctrine no longer required proof. The rifle squad's volume of fire was only the leading edge of the deeper mechanism. 15 years before Normandy, 2 field artillery officers at Fort Sill, Major Carlos Brewer, and following him as head of the gunnery department, Major Orlando Ward, had worked out a system for coordinating fire from a single centralized command point rather than leaving each battery to fire independently against its own targets. In the spring of 1931, the Field Artillery School successfully demonstrated massing an entire battalion's fire from this kind of centralized fire direction center, a proposition that much of the artillery world at the time treated with polite indifference. Since the radio equipment of the era seemed inadequate to the communication demands the idea implied, the concept these 2 officers put in place, refined by other artillerymen through the following decade, would eventually let a single forward observer call in the concentrated fire of far more guns than any one battery alone could offer. By 1944, the American Army had built on that foundation a capability that let a platoon leader, looking at a hedgerow he could not see, and to transmit a 6-digit map coordinate and, within a matter of minutes, bring dozens or even hundreds of artillery shells down onto that grid square from multiple battalions firing in coordination. German artillery doctrine, by comparison, generally required pre-plotted survey positions and more deliberate calculation, and an unexpected threat from an unanticipated direction could take considerably longer to bring under fire. A response that still depended on the kind of direct observation the German system had always been built around. The asymmetry was not one of courage or of raw engineering skill, German gunnery, judged purely as a technical craft, was excellent, and German artillery officers were not less capable than their American counterparts. What the Fort Sill system offered was something closer to a change in institutional plumbing, a rerouting of authority, so that the decision to mass overwhelming fire no longer had to climb up a chain of command and back down again before it could be executed. It lived, instead, at the level of the men actually standing in the hedgerow, which meant it could act in the same few minutes in which a German rifleman still believed his position was secure at Hill 192, a piece of high ground east of St. Lo that dominated the roads into the city. The American 2nd Infantry Division spent nearly a month grinding forward against paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, dug into the same bocage terrain that had bled the British so badly further north. Concentrated artillery fire, called down repeatedly against suspected rather than confirmed positions, kept the German defenders under nearly continuous bombardment, denying them the kind of pattern recognition experienced infantry usually develop under fire. The learned sense of when a barrage is likely to lift, when movement becomes survivable again, when a position can be safely reoccupied. When the hill finally fell on the 11th of July, the 2nd Infantry Division had paid for it with 594 men killed and roughly 3,000 wounded, a heavy price by any measure, but the German paratroopers holding the position had been effectively destroyed in the process, their bodies found afterwards still in excellent camouflage. Killed in many documented cases by an enemy that had never visually located them at all. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing to the German High Command before he was wounded by an Allied air attack in July, described the cause with the clarity of a professional who understood exactly what was killing his men. Also in evidence, he wrote, is there great superiority in artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. Rommel, among the most respected practitioners of mobile warfare in the German officer corps, was not describing better marksmanship, and he was certainly not describing superior camouflage on the American side. He was describing a system and noting, in the driest and most professional language available to him, that his own army had no comparable answer to it. The final piece of this mechanism did not arrive in Normandy at all. It arrived 6 months later in the snow along the German border, and it closed off the last possibility that a man's camouflage, however perfect, might still buy him something. By December 1944, the paratrooper who died east of St. Lo had been dead for 5 months, and the war he had fought in had moved into a different season entirely, mud giving way to frozen ground, hedgerows giving way to pine forest and open snowfields where a different generation of German infantrymen dug in and waited under the same discipline of stillness that had been drilled into every soldier who ever wore Schick's patterns. What was coming toward them had been sitting in a warehouse, untouched by the fighting in France, for 2.5 years. For 2.5 years, the American and British navies had guarded a piece of technology called the proximity fuse, a miniature radio transmitter built into the nose of an artillery shell, broadcasting continuously as the round flew toward its target. When the reflected signal indicated the shell had reached an optimal height above the ground, the fuse detonated automatically, producing an airburst rather than a ground impact. The secrecy around it had been extraordinary. The fuse reserved almost entirely for anti-aircraft use at sea, where a dud round falling into the ocean posed little risk of capture. Army commanders had asked for permission to use it against ground targets more than once and had been refused, on the reasoning that the value of surprise outweighed whatever advantage earlier deployment might offer, and that a single unexploded shell recovered from French or Belgian soil could hand German engineers the design outright. In December 1944, with German forces pouring through the Ardennes in the last major offensive the Wehrmacht would ever mount? General Eisenhower asked again, and this time the answer changed almost immediately. Within days, formal clearance came through, and by the final weeks of the month, hundreds of thousands of shells, fitted with the new fuse, were being fed into American howitzers along the front. The reasoning had simply caught up with the moment. German ground forces were no longer in any position to meaningfully exploit captured technology before the war itself ended. So the calculation that had held the fuse back for 2.5 years no longer applied. What made the fuse so consequential for a man trying to survive in a foxhole had nothing to do with accuracy in the way that word is normally used. It had to do with geometry. A soldier lying flat against the earth, tucked into a shallow scrape or dug in beneath a hedge bank, had been protected since the trench fighting of the First World War by a simple physical fact. Fragments from a shell that strikes the ground travel outward and mostly upward from the point of impact, and a body pressed flat to the earth often lay beneath the worst of that arc. Every camouflage discipline, every lesson about staying low and staying still, assumed that the ground itself offered a kind of partial shelter even in the open. The proximity fuse erased that shelter by changing where the shell detonated. The burst happened above a man rather than beside him, and the fragments came down onto him from directly overhead. No posture solved that problem. No depth of foxhole within reason solved it either. And no camouflage pattern, however brilliantly designed to defeat a human eye, had any answer at all to a shell that had never needed a human eye to find its target in the first place. German engineers had, in fact, looked into building something similar earlier in the war and concluded that the electronics required could not survive the acceleration of being fired from a gun barrel while spinning at high speed. On the narrow technical question, they were not unreasonable. Vacuum tube technology of the kind available in German laboratories genuinely struggled with exactly that problem. But the assessment left German ground forces heading into the last winter of the war with no defensive answer to a weapon their own engineers had judged, not unreasonably, should not have been possible to build at all. General George Patton, in a report written not long after the fuse reached his own artillery, credited it directly with helping to save the city of Liège from German attack, and stated plainly that its introduction would require every army to rethink the tactics soldiers used to take cover from artillery fire. Patton was not a commander in the habit of crediting equipment over the men who used it. The specific exception he made for this fuse says something about how completely it altered the basic arithmetic of survival under bombardment. Layer that development on top of everything that had already been assembled in Normandy 6 months earlier. The Grand's rate of fire, reconnaissance by fire, as standard procedure, a fire direction system that could turn a suspected grid square into a saturated one within minutes. And the German rifleman in his oak leaf smock, the technical culmination of more than a decade of serious camouflage research, was left facing an army whose entire theory of finding him did not actually require finding him. It required only a reasonable confidence that he was somewhere inside a defined patch of ground, and a willingness to put enough fire into that patch of ground that the distinction between confirmed and suspected simply stopped mattering. The confusion recorded in German interrogation transcripts that summer borders on something close to philosophical. These were not careless or inexperienced men. They were soldiers who understood in the specific and practical way that experienced soldiers understand their own survival, what should and should not get them killed. Their training held as an almost unstated axiom that detection had to precede death, that a man who had done everything correctly to remain unseen had, by definition, done everything he could to remain alive. When that axiom failed, and it failed again and again through the summer of 1944, The men who survived long enough to be captured struggled to describe what had actually happened to them, because the language they had been trained in did not contain a category for it. What the German army could not produce was not courage, and it was not technical skill in any single component of the fight. It had capable artillery, it had disciplined infantry, it had, in Otto Schick's patents, camouflage that no other army on earth could match. What it did not have was all of those pieces integrated down to the level of a single junior officer's radio handset, a capability the American Army had spent roughly 15 years quietly building during a period when most of the world, including a fair share of America's own military establishment, considered rifle volume and artillery coordination to be settled, secondary questions not worth much further investment. Here, stated plainly, is the conclusion this evidence points toward. The German rifleman in the hedgerow did not fail. His camouflage did not fail. The discipline that kept him motionless for 6 hours did not fail. What failed was the underlying theory of warfare. He had been trained inside a theory in which visibility was the necessary precondition for lethality, a theory shared symmetrically by the German army that had perfected concealment, and by the British army that had suffered so badly from it 6 weeks earlier. Both of those armies, fighting each other through the bocage, were playing the same game by the same rules, and within that shared framework, the Germans were, for a long stretch of that summer, simply better. The American army that arrived afterward was not better at that same game. It had stopped playing it. Its doctrine treated the patch of terrain, not the specific man hidden inside it, as the actual target, and once a patch of terrain was judged plausible, everything that followed was procedure. Comb it with machine gun fire, drop mortar rounds onto it, call in massed artillery, drive an armored vehicle straight through it. A soldier could be wearing the most sophisticated, dappled pattern that a Munich art professor had ever designed, and none of it would matter, because that pattern was a property of the man, and the American response was aimed at the ground he happened to be occupying rather than at him specifically. None of this reflects some singular flash of American tactical genius, the kind the war's popular memory likes to imagine. It reflects the accumulated, largely unglamorous output of 3 separate institutional investments made over roughly 15 years by people who were not thinking about camouflage at all, a fire direction concept worked out by 2 artillery officers on a dusty post in Oklahoma, a semi-automatic rifle pushed through a skeptical ordnance bureaucracy, and a secret radio fuse kept locked away by the Navy until the final winter of the war. None of the institutions responsible for those 3 programs set out to solve the problem of German camouflage specifically. Camouflage was never the target any of them were aiming at. It simply stopped mattering as a side effect of solving 3 other problems entirely. The patterns Otto Schick designed did not disappear with the war that first tested them. Their underlying logic, organic shapes built to break down the outline of a moving human body rather than mimic a fixed background, would go on to influence camouflage research for decades afterward, in armies that had drawn a very different lesson from Normandy than the one this account has just described. Armies preparing for a kind of warfare in which a man being seen by another man, rather than a coordinate being fed into a howitzer, remained the central danger. Whatever became of Schick himself after 1945 is not well documented. What can be said with more confidence is that his patterns were not a failed technology. They were a genuinely brilliant answer to a problem that the American army fighting through the Norman hedgerows had simply declined almost entirely by institutional accident to pose in the first place. The paratrooper east of St. Lo died without ever understanding what had actually killed him, because the framework he had trained inside had no room in it for the idea of dying unseen. The German theory of combat was, in that sense, deterministic. If undetected, then unharmed. The American theory was probabilistic. Detection was never guaranteed. So the system existed to make that uncertainty survivable for the side doing the shooting. Through sheer density and speed of fire, rather than through precision, both theories were internally coherent on their own terms. Only one of them matched the ground, actually, beneath that hedgerow in the summer of 1944, and it was not the one the 6 motionless hours had been spent trusting